There's been a pretty bad trend in Detroit lately. You talk about the guy who had won the Calder last season and how good he was as a member of this Red Wings blue line. He was dominant. He was an absolute performer. He would reverse hits like crazy. He would set people up like crazy. He had a whole bunch of points, and he won the Calder because of it. Let's talk today about Moritz Seider and the pairing that he has had with Ben Chiarot, and how, thus far, this pairing really has not been all too great. Now, just a few weeks ago, we already made a video talking about Seider and the quote-unquote sophomore slump that you could debate that he is going through at the moment. Sophomore slump usually occurs when NHL players who are rookies are super good in their first year, but in their second years, there's so much footage on how they play that other NHL teams that are playing these new players can say, okay, well, Lucas Raymond was really good last year, but look at this, we have ourselves all this footage now as to how he plays. Now we know how to counter him. And the sophomore slump usually occurs because second-year NHL players are not used to the sudden change in how the opponents play them. When they're rookies, there's no real scouting report that the opposition has, so you're just kind of free to do whatever you want. But in your second year, teams sort of start to catch on as to your tendencies and what you like to do in the offensive zone, thus leading to an easier time shutting you down. For Seider, it's not necessarily that this situation has happened to him per se. More so, you could say that Seider and his slump is sort of the product of the guy that he is playing with on his own team. This season, Moritz Seider, in the 20-something games that he has, 21 games, has 11 points. He's on pace for 43 points on the season, 8 goals, 35 assists, which would be a setback from what he had last season as a rookie with the Wings. However, the point production, even though it's not necessarily in the same tier, okay, he's on pace for 7 fewer points. How much of a big deal is that, Lego? What are you doing talking about this guy as if he's going through a full-on slump? Well, there's a reason why we're talking about this again, and I say again because as we had talked about in the first video, there was already a few conclusions that we could make about Seider and the way that he is playing. The reason this is a problem, primarily in the eyes of most Red Wings fans, seems to be because of his line mate, one Ben Chiarot, who was acquired by the Red Wings this offseason in the free agency period. Chiarot is 31 years old, making 4.75 AAV till the end of 2026, meaning that he's going to be here for a while. And even though he was a guy that, as a member of the Montreal Canadiens, I really liked, I made the entire video talking about how he had signed with Detroit and how this was a brilliant move because, at the end of the day, this is just Stevie Y loading up on assets that make your team more difficult to play against. But if you go over to Chiarot and his game log, he's got 6 points in 21 games played, on pace for 24, which actually would be a career high for the guy, but points was never really the reason you got Chiarot in your lineup in the first place. You wanted him because he's a physical guy. He really makes the opposition's lives difficult in your own zone, and in front of your goaltender, he is just an absolute nightmare for opponent players that are trying to bang in rebounds and get cross creases right in front, etc., etc. Chiarot's a good defensive guy, and he was that for the Canadiens when they went to the Stanley Cup Finals playing on the first pairing. However, when you have Seider and Chiarot playing together, this is what you get. Here's a post made on the Red Wings subreddit by Crystal Ammunition. Ben Chiarot and Moritz Seider have given up more goals against than any other pairing in the league. Should they be split up? And linked is an image from, I believe, what's this website? I can't recall off the top of my head. It's not Evolving Hockey, that's for sure, but either way, it lists all the NHL D pairings in the league, and it talks about goals against. Ben Chiarot and Moritz Seider have 21 goals against, which is indeed the worst pairing in the league. Second is Trouba and Miller from the Rangers. They have 20 goals against. Falk and Torrey Krug have 19 on the St. Louis Blues. And then you have yourselves Savard and Cooley for the Canadiens. You can see as the list goes down, there are more and more pairings, but Chiarot and Seider being the very worst one is quite noteworthy. What I wanted to do was also read you some comments going over some introductory ideas to this conversation, and I wanted to respond with my own thoughts as well. The first comment on this Reddit post by Pesky Prussian says they don't work well together at all. Chiarot puts himself out of position all the time and has been bad at defending transitions as well. I think he'd be fine as the X-Factor guy in a lower pair, but against top matchups, the risks that he takes are getting him and Seider eaten alive, particularly because he's taking transition opportunities away from Seider. Chiarot has more 5v5 shot attempts than Seider does, which really is not what we want to be happening. Whack Attack then says at the same time, last night Walman was hoisting shots from everywhere. Seider needs a guy who just defers to him and doesn't try to do too much. Chiarot and Walman both try to do that. So does that mean that Osterley should be the guy playing with Seider instead? No chance we try to split up Hronek and Mata, as they've been outstanding. Now, this is a really interesting conversation, because I think it kind of shines a lot of light as to why the Seider pairing last year was so effective. Of course, we know it was effective because Seider is a talented player, but there's more than meets the eye here. Obviously, it takes two to tango, and two to tango especially if you are a defensive pairing in the National Hockey League. Playing for the Montreal Canadiens, Ben Chiarot spent a lot of time playing with Shea Weber, a guy that wasn't really all too mobile, but he could be a very good defensive rock. I feel like this sort of molded Chirot's game into one where he sort of felt the responsibility to try to take the lead a little bit more in transition heading up towards the ice. For a guy like Moritz Seider, he is not Shea Weber. He is not immobile. He is not an absolute rock. I mean, he's kind of a rock in his own right because he's such a big German wall, but Moritz Seider can skate. Moritz Seider can transition the puck very well with his breakout passes and his reads in his own zone into the neutral zone. Ben Chiarot trying to compensate for that in the same way that he played with Weber with Seider is kind of doing them both a disservice. Seider is more talented than Ben Chiarot, and so I feel like it would be more appropriate for Seider to be the guy doing more and kind of taking charge of the pairing. I like how Pesky Prussian puts it. I think that Chiarot would be fine as the X-Factor guy in a lower pair, but against top matchups, it's not going all too well. Meanwhile, that second comment by Whack Attack talks about how Seider needs a guy who just defers to him and doesn't try to do too much. And when I read that, I think immediately, oh, last year, Seider had Danny DeKeyser on his pairing pretty much the whole time. And even though DeKeyser sucked, he wasn't a good player by any means, he just kind of knew his role. He knew that Seider was the guy that was going to do the heavy lifting, that Seider was the guy that was going to be breaking the puck out, that Seider was the guy that would probably do the majority of transition offense from that D pairing. DeKeyser knew that he had to step back and just kind of be a defensive presence that was able to stay in position properly, for the most part at the very least, and just survive. DeKeyser playing in Vancouver during the preseason on his PTO kind of really enlightened me to the type of playstyle that he has, where he's like, yeah, no, he really just allows the other guy on his pairing to shine. And playing with Seider last year, he sort of did that in the best way possible. Now that Seider is playing on a pairing where you have an actually talented guy alongside of you, I definitely do think that Chiarot's a much better player than DeKeyser. It sort of messes with the mojo a little bit. And so when it comes to what the Red Wings do here, obviously Lalonde has the option of just keeping them together and saying, okay, Seider, you're playing on a pairing with a good player now that actually tries to take control of the game more. This is how you need to adapt. You need to go out there and grow your game in a way that allows you to feed off of the energy that a Ben Chiarot gives you, because it's so much different than what Danny DeKeyser had, where he just pretty much had you doing all the work. Now that you're sharing the load, now that you're playing with a guy that is trying to do a lot more, how are you going to react to that? If Lalonde decides to put Seider with another pairing, then okay, we'll see what exactly happens there. But for now, Ben Chiarot and Moritz Seider have played, what's the time on ice? 294 minutes in total together, and they have given up the worst amount of goals in the National Hockey League. Their other numbers are also listed here. They have 12 goals for, which is actually pretty high up on this list. It's tied up with Falcon, Krug, and Savard and Cooley. It pales in comparison to Erik Karlsson and Jacob Megna, though. Yeah, that's a pairing that's pretty good because Erik freaking Karlsson is Erik freaking Karlsson. But still, talk to the comments on your thoughts about the Detroit Red Wings and their pairing of Seider and Chiarot. We already made a video talking about Seider and the sophomore slump. Do you think this indeed is a part of that? Is this sort of decline of Seider's in his second year the sophomore slump in the flesh, or is this just Ben Chiarot? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.